The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 11, Freedom at a Price. Sometime during that long night, the screaming got too loud for the guard, and the heavy door slid back with a reverberation that shook our boxcar. "Be quiet, or I'll shoot," he bellowed. "Yes, yes, please shoot us." The response was instantaneous from everywhere. We'd been stuffed in the evening before, 50 and 60 per car, after a long, tiring march with neither food nor water nor any chance to relieve ourselves. Inside, on the newly built tiers of shelves, one could neither sit nor stretch out. Quickly, we'd used up the oxygen in the closed car, and the fear of being slowly asphyxiated added to the panic. Most of the lucky ones at the door edges and cracks desperately clung to their privileged spots, while a few generously gave up their places so that others might have a turn at the precious air also. Even here one saw demonstrated those gracious acts that indicate nobility of character, no matter what the circumstances. Hours passed. Still the train didn't move. Why couldn't we have been left outside in the chill night air rather than have to suffer this? It was another question for which there wasn't an answer. Judging from the noise outside, part of the reason must have been that others were still being processed. It was a big job to get 2,000 prisoners under lock and key. Who knows? If we'd been left outside, some miserable, emaciated wretch might have escaped. I could hardly believe it would have been such a great loss for our captors. In fact, there were probably more who died during that dreadful night than those who would have had the strength to slip away in the darkness. And so when we screamed too loudly, the guard's threat seemed a favor which we begged him to fulfill. "Yes, put us out of our misery," we yelled back. Though I never seriously considered suicide during those years, there were times when I would have welcomed death. If to be with Christ is far better than even the pleasant, peaceful lives that some are permitted to live, how must that prospect have contrasted with the reality around me? Of course death would have seemed a welcome release, but God had already preserved me so miraculously that I just couldn't believe it was all going to end now on this wretched train somewhere east of Berlin. And if I was meant to live, it must be a life with meaning. There must be a reason why I, Maria Linke, was crouched on that hard board with an elbow in my ribs on one side and a demented voice shrieking, "Eric, Eric," over and over again in my ear on the other. I have what one might call a penetrating voice. It seems a nicer way to put it than to say commanding, harsh, or booming, though truthfully my vocal equipment came generously endowed with all these qualities. "Ladies," I began hopefully. The term certainly didn't seem to apply to anyone there. "Ladies, I have something interesting to tell you." What it was I didn't yet know, but God would show me something if I could just get their attention. I was sure of that. "She has something interesting to tell us," mimicked a young woman near me, "like what's on the menu tonight, or whether it's tea or coffee we'd prefer. Is that it?" A coarse laugh came from her cracked lips. "There is still a God, and he hasn't forgotten us," I plunged on. "Then let him get me a drink," came from somewhere, and from another corner, "Shh, don't talk like that. Let her speak." "I've experienced God's care in similar circumstances," I continued, "when there didn't seem any hope. He can do miracles for us even here. Let me tell you some of the impossible things that God has done for me. It might give us courage to believe that he can help us now." It was quiet enough around me to begin, and as others leaned forward, I could hear an annoyed shh making the rounds in the corners. Soon every woman was listening as I told of those far-off days in Siberia, beginning with that amazing meeting with my father in Tajbulatova. I interspersed my story with amusing anecdotes wherever I could, but always I came back to the love of God and the hindrances men put in the way of his love. I told them about that other trip by boxcar to Moscow and Petrograd when I was a child, and of our meeting with loved ones in Stettin. In the now hushed stillness, I talked about my brother and those hopes that hadn't come true in the way we'd wished, but which would have their fulfillment in a better place. As long as I talked, the women remained quiet and attentive, caught up in times and places far removed from their own, yet so similar. Whether there was anything done for eternity there in that steaming boxcar, I couldn't say. Perhaps it was I who really needed strengthening as I rehearsed the wonders that God had already wrought in my life. As the train began to move and pick up speed, a cooling breeze forced its way through the cracks, giving us some hope of survival. Back and forth from one track to another, we were shunted in constantly changing directions until it was impossible to tell where we were heading. Those near the walls could detect from the brightening slivers of light the approaching day. Otherwise, the blackness was unchanged. We were thrown forward, tumbling over one another as the brakes tugged at the shrieking wheels and pulled the train to a lurching stop. From afar, we could hear the doors being pulled back with a thudding jolt, and now that the wheels no longer filled the air with their metallic clatter, we could hear the distressed sounds from the other cars. One word could be distinguished from up and down the track, the pitiful cry, "Water." Our door, too, was flung open, and a bunch of herring came flying in. Herring? What new cruelty was this? We were hungry, it was true, but even worse was our thirst, and those salted fish would only increase that torture. I determined not to eat any, but hunger won out, and I snatched at mine and tore into it just as everyone else was doing. Thirst must be experienced to understand the terrible pain. Dried-out tissues feel ready to burst, and something like salty herring will set mouth and throat to bleeding. As the agony increased, some of the women caught the last liquid left in their bodies and lapped it up. It was salty, too. 3 or 4 days we were on the train, and during that time our doors were opened for only 2 reasons: to throw in a daily ration of food, mercifully not always herring, and to remove the dead. It is strange what memories linger after so many years. All of us had seen our loved ones laid out, so it wasn't the presence or even the prevalence of death itself that was so awful. What I remember with the most awesome clarity is the sound of the bodies as they were thrown from the cars. That terrible thud seemed to symbolize for me all the lack of tenderness and love which attended the passing of these poor men and women. Grabbed by an arm and a leg, they were flung like cordwood on embankment or siding, to lie there as a mute reminder that such a pitiless death awaited us too. I remembered so well the deep reverence that the Russians of my youth had always had for the dead. I had stood by the street with my brother in Verkhovsk when the body of old Pyotr had been carried by in a horse-drawn wagon. The coffin was open, as was the custom, and the old indigent shepherd, at repose in the simple wooden box, had received a deep and reverent bow from each passer-by on that busy Saturday morning. Poor and humble as he was, he'd gone with respect and honor to the burying ground, while here the wife of one of Berlin's most distinguished professors and the daughter of a clergyman lay in a heap of stiffening corpses, their only attendants the bored guards who tried to keep some semblance of order in the growing pile. This nightmare, too, came to an end, and we arrived at last at Landsberg on der Warthe, a former army garrison of sturdy red brick barracks and administrative buildings situated on a rise overlooking the river. From the 8 slots of the gun rack on our wall, I gathered that each room had once housed 8 German soldiers. Now that same narrow space was packed with at least 50 women. Of course, the metal beds with their rough gray army blankets had long since been removed. Now there were just the usual wooden shelves, which, again, didn't begin to accommodate those who were shoved into the room. The windows had slats nailed across from the outside, and from the ceiling hung one 25-watt bulb. Here there were no exposed latrines, but what we had was far worse. In each room was a gasoline drum, lid cut off and edges sharp as a knife against our thin flesh. It was here at Landsberg that lice made their appearance among us for the first time. I'd known these vermin in Siberia and had learned how to deal with them there, but in this dark room it was almost impossible to catch them, and soon our bodies became infected from the dirty scratches. To add to our misery, the hall faucets were kept locked, and the hot July sky only rarely granted us a cooling and cleansing rain. Quarrels flared over trivial matters. Perhaps one's sleeping partner was large and weighted down the boards on her side. Then, as she shifted position during the restless hours of the night, one was pinched between the sagging boards. The apportionment of food was, of course, a matter for close and jealous attention. A tiny person like our Ulrika got a piece of bread as large as Bertha's. Was it fair, someone insisted? Tante Olga snored. Frau Mieker talked incessantly. The society woman Elda von Kuhn lamented her lost jewels. Gisela took more than her allotted time with a gasoline can, and so it went. Who could blame them? We saw no evidence that any of us were to be released. The only chance of leaving seemed by transport further east, which none of us wished, or by death, which many now sought. Edith was a quiet young woman, reserved, retaining some ladylike qualities even here. One evening she was more talkative than usual. She spoke of her home and family with an intensity that made me strangely uneasy. That night I lay awake, staring into the darkness after the others were asleep, listening for I wasn't sure what. Then there it was, a soft, rustling movement on the other side where Edith lay. The creak of a board and the light footfalls of someone trying to be ever so careful. I listened tensely, every nerve taut. When I heard the doorknob rattle, I was on my feet in an instant, groping my way toward the sound, feeling in the darkness for the kneeling body. It was there, just as I had thought, and from the sob I knew it was Edith. She'd already twisted her tattered slip around her neck and was preparing to attach it to the handle of the door. I called out now, and several helping hands moved her back to the bunk, where we tried to calm and comfort her. Miraculously, this sensitive woman survived without a further breakdown, and was one of the first of our number to be released, though not until 1950. She was one of the many who was saved for a happy reunion with husband and children. Others did succeed in taking the easy way, but I was always sorry, not only for their sakes, but for those who awaited them in vain at home. One of these near tragedies was to have more than usual interest for me. I'd been told to go to the commandant's office in the next building. It was a time when prisoners were normally in their rooms, and the man on the stairs above me must have thought he was alone. What I saw made my feet fly. Desperately, I tugged at the torn shirt by which he hung, suspended from one of the balustrade supports above him. He couldn't have been there more than seconds, and despite his attempt, the will to live was still strong. When he was breathing normally again, I talked briefly with him and prayed that God would give him the strength to go on, though one day I was to wish that he might have died this easier death. The conversation I overheard one day between two officers was one which I didn't dare share with my fellow prisoners for fear that the number of suicides would mount even higher. They were discussing our transport to Russia. It didn't surprise me, but it was the one fear that we always tried to put behind us. Now I kept this dread secret to myself and wondered at every roll call or any change in routine whether it signaled the beginning of a new transport. There were other conversations which made my heart stop, too. "How many Germans have died?" one officer asked another in Russian. "Not enough," was the reply. We were apparently too many even to be useful as labor, so our decimation was welcome. Of course, there were the good guards, those from whom we could expect some humanity, some easing of the burden under which we lived. Sasha was one of these, and through him I learned that though we had been destined for Russian labor camps, the transports from Landsberg had been canceled. Even the one that had already been sent was due back any day. Indeed, it was only a few days later that a crowd of men staggered into the compound, attracting my attention even among the emaciated beings surrounding us. With 3 others, I'd been carrying the soup kettle to our barracks. It was a thick barley stew, quite edible. Pieces of meat could even be detected occasionally if one looked closely. Obviously, the specters who were marched into the compound stared at our heavy kettles with only one thing in mind: food. It didn't take long to discover that these were the men who had been sent out 3 weeks earlier and now were back, more dead than alive. They hadn't been counted in the day's food allotment. so we shared with them, hearing in the meanwhile a little of their terrible suffering. The train had been marked as equipment, and the men ordered to be quiet, but who can stifle every cough and groan, especially when one is ill? In short, the Poles had discovered that prisoners were being transported across their borders. At that time, they could still refuse admittance to this human cargo, and they'd done so in no uncertain terms. Later, they wouldn't have dared. Now here were the prisoners back at Landsberg and reveling in the good food and fine accommodations. That night, I, too, tried to summon a feeling of thankfulness as I sought some position in which to lay my bones comfortably upon the wooden shelf. The Russian lessons I'd been giving didn't stop with the news we'd heard. It was a worthwhile diversion and useful here, and I continued enthusiastically. The blackout paper on the transom over the door of our barracks room made a passable blackboard, and the piece of limestone which I'd found on the grounds provided the chalk. With a weak light coming over the top of the boarded-up windows, the letters could just be seen. Perhaps never was class held in such dismal surroundings, but for many of those bored and depressed women, it was truly the highlight of the day. Though the women had no regular work at Landsberg, many of us were given small administrative tasks. One that fell to my lot was to report the prisoner count to the kitchen. When the shouted summons came every morning at 2 a.m., I was awake at the first syllable, it seemed. Had I missed this rather unpleasant assignment, I would have missed as well one of the tastiest morsels ever to pass between my lips or down the front of my dress. The guards often prepared some snack for themselves in the kitchen during the long night. This time it had been potato pancakes. "Do you want one?" someone asked laughingly. At the same moment, a hot pancake flew through the air. Instinctively, I grabbed it. "Attention!" The command sounded smartly from behind me, and I froze. The captain of the guard had entered, and the soldiers were saluting. What to do with a burning cake? I wanted that treat so badly. Only one place to put it, and that was down the front of my dress. It lay there, searing the tender skin, while I reported the count. Then, while hurrying out of the building as fast as I could, I reached in and took it out, along with some of my skin. What was the pain compared to the glorious taste of potato pancake? I enjoyed every bite before slipping back to my room. In the morning, rumors of a new disease circulated in our barracks. "Have you seen Maria's chest? It looks bad," said one. "Don't go near her. It might be contagious," came from another. "I've seen something like that before. She died, too." This from an authority, obviously. I could hardly keep from smiling, but I kept my secret. The warm, delicious pancake so nicely filled that empty space in my shrunken stomach. As for the disease, I knew that with time I'd recover. Potatoes figured in another story, too. Among our inmates were doctors as well as other professional people. They did what they could for us, but they were entirely under the jurisdiction of the Russian medical commandant. If our inmate doctor was too liberal, in other words, if they discovered that he'd excused anyone from roll call for anything less than 102 temperature, he could get into trouble. Things went worse for us, too, if he tried to get us extra privileges, so the criterion was usually mobility. If one could move, one appeared at roll call. Of course, there were many who were ill enough to qualify for this exemption, and on one occasion our camp commandant ordered special potatoes for these sick women. We didn't need to be told to keep this quiet, so when the cook issued the cooked potatoes, another prisoner and I carried them inside our dresses to the barracks. Here, on some sort of pretext, I called to a guard to open the door. The other woman moaned unintentionally. The potatoes were hot, and the guard looked at her suspiciously. "She's got TB. Let her in so she can lie down." The words came in a moment of inspiration. There was no disease any of us, guards included, feared more than tuberculosis. The door opened, and in we went to serve our precious load to our sick women. It wasn't long before all of us learned to welcome the appearance on the roll call grounds of our tall, silver-haired commandant, Major Nikitin, and to dread the more frequent presence of his aide, Captain Shishka. Nikitin was soft-spoken and courteous, and there was often a look on his patrician features that made me think from the beginning that he had a distinct distaste for his job. Captain Shishka was Nikitin's exact opposite. Roll call was at 6 a.m., At least that's when we began to stand on the parade grounds. The first time I was in charge of reporting the number of women present, I lined them up according to instructions, counted by tens, and walked up to the captain. 491, I reported smartly, and 9 sick. Had I said something wrong? He was glaring at me, eyes starting from their sockets. Don't you know proper military behavior? To the cooler, he shouted. I was carted off, bewildered, to the damp, dark, underground cell to think over my behavior. Having no clue as to what I'd done wrong, I thought in vain. The first day it was water, the next bread, and then again water. Still I'd come to no conclusion. When I was released the 4th day and again stood at the roll call grounds to report, I apparently did no better, for this time Captain Shishka was just as angry and told 2 of his aides to teach me military etiquette. On either side of the grounds they stood, while I was chased from one to the other. Halt! Run! Attention! Report! What did it all mean? I ran, stopped, saluted, stood at attention, and reported. Back to the cooler. Obviously, I hadn't passed the test. This time Major Nikitin came to see me on one of his rounds of the camp. I was to discover that this was not an unusual occurrence. I was so disarmed by his personal interest in the fate of one of Landsberg's 9,000 prisoners that I was only too eager to tell him I had no idea why I was there. He smiled gently. You must never approach an officer nearer than 3 meters, nor stand further away than 5. It's quite simple. But no one told me, I wailed. It would have been simpler to explain it to me from the start. Horrified, I stopped. What had I said? A prisoner didn't dare talk so familiarly to a commandant, and yet it had come so naturally. Curiously, I looked at him and sensed already that something deep and tragic and enigmatic lay beneath the half-smile which hovered so strangely over his sad face. It wasn't long before a distinct rivalry became apparent between our 2 commandants. Frequently, Major Nikitin came to the women's quarters to inquire after our welfare, and though obviously there was little he could do to relieve our physical sufferings, he did make some effort to spare us insults and abuse. On the other hand, Captain Shishka, who was directly responsible for our physical welfare, never showed the slightest concern. It became my duty to accompany the major on inspection rounds, and gradually, as we talked more freely, I came to know and appreciate this Russian officer who seemed so unsuited to the work he had to do. I could see he'd gotten himself into a dangerous position, countermanding or mitigating the harsh orders which came from above, and yet if he were too decent, he'd surely be removed and no longer be able to do anything for us. Soon I was going along as interpreter to the fields where our men worked harvesting the bean crop. This region had been incorporated into Poland, and when the Germans had been driven out, they'd left their rich fields planted and ready for the conqueror to harvest. We'd leave the car and driver on the roadside and make our way between the rows to talk to one or another of their laborers. The nature of Nikitin's questions puzzled me from the start. Why are you here? He wanted to know first of all. Then, what did you do before? And how did you used to live? The answers seemed to surprise him. At first he was skeptical about the good life these men had known. Then when all the answers coincided, he still couldn't seem to accept it. Next he turned his attention to me. Forget you're a prisoner, Frau Linke, he said. Tell me now, do all Germans live as they said? We've been told that the capitalists live in fine houses, but the working class lives in hovels and holes in the ground. Is it true? I laughed. Of course we have poor people, but instead of having Bavarian china, they eat out of plain china. As for holes, my family wasn't well off, but we had a house, certainly not a hole in the ground. I wondered if he'd been serious. But several rooms, you mean? All for your family? Yes, of course. Well, we did at first live in one room, but only our family. But we were just beginning then. I didn't tell him how we'd lived in Siberia. It hardly seemed kind, and he was having such a hard time comprehending what I'd already said. Travel, Frau Linke? Could you really travel freely to other countries? It interested him particularly, and when I told him that my own very ordinary relatives had gone to Canada and America, all reticence broke down. I don't know now what to believe. What I see even in this destruction and here, it's so different from what I've been told. Ah, I said lightly, politicians always lie. Hitler, too? He asked in surprise. Would you, a German, say that? Yes, of course, I replied with conviction, especially Hitler. A few days later, Nikitin called me to his office for a more personal interview. We were alone, and he tried to put me at my ease. Maria, I've often asked you about your arrest, about how you've been treated so far, and you've not committed yourself. Why? The question put me on my guard, though I felt I should trust him. My hesitant answer to a similar query in those first days of May had been the cause of my worst suffering so far, so I tried to be non-committal. Oh, we try to forget the bad times and hope for better days, I said evasively. It's the bad times I want to know about, specifically, he insisted. Oh, please, sir, don't make me talk about it, I pleaded. I'm afraid to. Confidentially, he leaned forward across the desk. What you hear from me could bring your freedom if you report me to my superior. Listen carefully. This is not what I fought for, to put women and children into these deadly camps. You tell my superior that, and you could gain your freedom. Now, don't be afraid. Tell me everything. He'd put himself in my hands by that statement, and I couldn't help but trust him. With no hesitation but that induced by modesty, I told him of the first days of my captivity, the loss of papers, the violence I'd suffered on the truck at the hands of the 8 soldiers, my nakedness, the terrible interrogation, and the nighttime executions on the march to Rathenau. That's over now, I said, but you see, some of the women are pregnant, and there's something else. It's VD. One of the soldiers, when he, back there on the truck, told me I couldn't go on. I didn't need to. The commandant trembled, fist clenched on his desk. As much as I can, I'll ease your lives here, he promised. And he did. As Major Nikitin continued his kind and subtle questioning in the days that followed, I told him of my husband Fred, unheard from since 1944. I said nothing of a personal nature about our relationship, but I had the feeling he sensed more than I cared to have revealed. With disarming gentleness, he urged me to give up all hope of ever seeing him again. Be realistic, Maria. He won't come back. It's just not likely. You should really try to forget him. Poor Fred. We hadn't parted with much affection when he'd gone off to war. I couldn't deceive myself into believing that I'd been heartbroken when we said goodbye. The heartbreak had come years before. Now, as Nikitin voiced the possibility that I'd not dared think of, I began to go back through the years to really re-evaluate the relationship that had begun so romantically with cold lemonade for a thirsty bicyclist on a hot summer's day. Our marriage had begun as auspiciously as most, I suppose. It had taken place at our farm home, with my parents under the happy delusion that Fred was a believer and a faithful member of my Berlin church. As to the latter, they were correct. As for being a believer, well, he'd come around, I told myself. During the previous months, we'd built a little summer house. It was situated on a small bit of suburban land we'd bought for weekend vegetable growing, and here our friends and family congregated on Saturdays and holidays, helping to put up the tiny 2-room shelter. It would be just the thing for weekend recreation and relaxation, and a good investment, too. Someday we'd build a fine home in front. 6 weeks after our wedding, my husband lost his job and didn't work again for 6 years. We remained in our garden house instead of looking for a city apartment. It was I who left early every morning for my job pressing finished shirts in a Berlin factory. It wasn't quite the way I'd planned it. At first, my husband did make a great effort to find a job. After all, it was rather demeaning to say goodbye to one's wife in the morning and have nothing more to do than feed a few chickens. The economic depression, however, had caused many humiliating necessities, and there were others like my husband who, because they had no children, didn't get on the preferred list for jobs. How sorry I felt for him, at first. Every morning I rode my bicycle to the station from where I caught the train. It wasn't too bad in summer and fall, but when the rains and snow came, it was just plain miserable. When I splashed home at night, cold and wet, it wasn't easy to greet pleasantly a husband who was seated comfortably by the fire. My paycheck had been intended for the little extra things that would make our young lives beautiful and fun. Now there wasn't enough even for the necessities. One of those expenses which ceased seeming to be a necessity was the Sunday train fare to the church. Fred dropped it first. "You go. It means more to you," he said. And then it was, "You get home so late, dinner is never on time." So I stopped too. How different life had become from our happy summer dreams. When I discovered that my husband had started gambling compulsively with every mark and pfennig he had or didn't have, I thought life just couldn't get any worse. I prayed that the Lord would help me out of my wretched circumstances, but with too guilty a conscience to spend much time at it, and with too little feeling of guilt for a total surrender to Christ. If I only worked a little harder, I thought. In 1932, I lost my job too. Having nothing else to do, I now went to work with a will on our forested plot of land. I dug stumps and built fences. I planted vegetables and berry bushes and flowers. My husband just wasn't cut out for gardening, he said, and I dug away alone. The flowers gained us as much food as the garden did. I loved flowers. They became a joy and comfort to me during those bleak days, and most naturally I wished to share them with others. When I began taking extra blooms to the bakery and the butcher shop, it was with no thought of receiving anything in return for them. Soon, however, I was asked to bring them regularly on Saturdays. "It's good for business," the butcher told me, and into my hands he thrust the cuttings from the day's sausages. The baker did the same with the day-old rolls, and so we ate. In the fields near our home worked many women whose husbands had city jobs, or who were doing the odd jobs that were becoming available. What to do with the small children was a problem until I offered for a small sum to care for them. We went for walks in fields and woods. I made up little plays which we enacted among the carrots and cabbages of my garden. I told endless stories. So this too brought in the small change which I must so carefully hide if it were to be there when the payments fell due. 6 years passed in this manner, years which seemingly the locusts devoured, but which surely the Lord meant for good in his future plan. At last, in 1936, Fred was again working as an engineer, and we were able to begin the dream house, which had been so long in coming. But now, however, the dream had lost its luster, and it was with little sense of expectancy or joy that I began to dig foundation trenches and mix cement that summer of 1937. Now, on an autumn day, 8 years later, I stood with 30 other women at the gate of Landsberg prison. I'd been sent to summon them, and we were all anxious to see if the latest rumor of our release were really true. Even I had my small hopes as I stood at the edge of the excited knot of women. When Major Nicotine read the list to see if everybody was accounted for, my name was missing. Listening dejectedly to the farewell speech, I heard the words freedom and home and peace, and wondered if they'd ever be meant for me. Carola was one of the lucky ones, though she tried to restrain her enthusiasm for my sake. She was German, the wife of a South American consul. She'd been home on a visit when war had broken out, and had been picked up as I'd been. Now she was to be released, and I wanted to say goodbye to her, but I noticed that the commandant was trying to get my attention. "Would you like to be free?" he said in a low voice when I approached. Free? Of course I wanted to be free. Tears of happiness came to my eyes. From utter dejection to this ecstasy, it was too much. "Yes," I managed to stammer. "Of course I'd like to be released." "You aren't on the list. I have no control over that. But there is one possibility. You could live on the outside, if you agree to be my wife." What fantastic nonsense was this? How lonely would a man have to be to make such a proposal? But on the other hand, how much must I want freedom to listen to his suggestion? To be done with that close proximity of sweaty bodies, the petty quarreling, the gasoline drums, to leave those watchtowers and fences and the whole dehumanizing camp. Desperately, I wanted to be delivered, but not at this price. I shook my head and turned away sadly. "Think it over, Maria. Don't waste your life away here." He never knew how much I wanted to think it over, but didn't dare. When I said goodbye to Carola, hastily relating to her the strange interview, she gave my hand a quick squeeze. "It's right what you're doing. Don't buy your freedom. You'll make it yet, honorably." She went then, and I stayed, the most unromantic figure imaginable, to have inspired the pitiful little love story which played itself out in Landsberg an der Warthe during that long autumn of 1945.